Let's take a moment to discuss some of what you discovered on your own personal timelines. This exercise isn't meant to dig up or relive past traumas. I'm not asking you to go deep into your psyche and try and think of really bad things that happened to you. No, your mind is going to remember what it needs to remember, and you don't need to push it or poke any harder than that. We're talking about a high level timeline where we're looking for an overview to recognize patterns of responses, patterns of types of situations that for some reason keep showing up in our lives. As an example of my own situation, I had a good childhood, which most of the women I work with say, right? I had a roof over my head, food on the table, loving parents, good education. But I also grew up in an environment where there's a lot of anger, a lot of fighting, a lot of tension. And it wasn't until I left my childhood home that looking back, I realized, like, man, not everybody goes through that stress. I also had some really intensely difficult things happen to me outside the home as a child that, again, didn't really realize how they affected me until when I was 18, I kind of moved out on my own, and I got hit with a horrible flare-up of ulcerative colitis. It was like my body was finally at peace. I finally felt safe. I finally had room to breathe. So which phase did I enter? I entered the healing phase. And that's when I got my diagnosis of ulcerative colitis at 18. And I just saw this pattern of like anger that I had held on to and frustration with authority figures in my life, parents, teachers, coaches, that it seemed unfair, unjust, hypocritical, that really ate away at me. And I saw that these patterns then continued into my adult life. In nursing school, I don't know if anybody else here has been through nursing school. It's an incredibly rigorous, intensive, at times abusive medical training. The phrase nurses eat their young is absolutely true. I had very vindictive professors. It was like they wanted to see you fail. And I had my first flare-up serious enough to put me in the hospital during nursing school because of what I was facing, that indigestible morsel conflict. Like I couldn't deal with just the attitudes around me. When I got my first job as a nurse, I got my dream position on an oncology unit working evenings. It was like right up the hill from where I lived. And when they found out about some of my religious beliefs that were going to affect the care I was going to be able to give, they took the job away from me and they moved me to this remote site, night shift, horrible nursing job. And I had a horrible boss again. So I put up with it for a year and I finally quit because I couldn't deal with it anymore. And so I had another flare up. The quitting the job put me into a conflict resolution healing phase, had a flare up in the hospital. I had another flare up after, being a caregiver for a terminally ill family member and experiencing narcissistic abuse from other family members during that time. That's also when I was diagnosed with Addison's disease. When I moved cross country after my mother died, I found myself like a fish out of water. And I knew no one in the area except for a few friends, but I suffered an abandonment isolation conflict that when it resolved, I had horribly high blood pressure, a water retention conflict. Again, like I went on to have more narcissistic bosses, and every time I quit, I would end up in the hospital with a flare up. Like, can you guys see my pattern? It's pretty clear. And then my most recent hospitalization was after a business issue where I had some intellectual property stolen and got lied to. And again, it was just this feeling of this is so unjust, this is so hypocritical. So not to belabor my life story is so bad, but in hindsight, with my understanding of conflict resolution, and healing phase symptoms, all my flare-ups make absolute sense now. And I saw some of you making those same connections when you were looking or when you were providing your feedback in the comments yesterday. So once I had that knowledge, like I understood what my patterns were and I understood where my symptoms were coming from, I had to set an intention for my own recovery. What is the root cause of these conflicts that keep recurring in my life? And so my recovery, my intention became about how to stop being dependent on others' approval for my peace of mind. I had to reframe my experiences of injustice and indignation and ask myself, how much was I a willing participant in because I was trying to be a people pleaser? And how much should I now moving forward just recognize and say, I don't want to be a part of that from the get-go. Like, don't put a year into a bad job if I can tell from the beginning this is going to just trigger all these old conflicts in me. I had to learn new ways of responding. So no longer bending over backwards with these codependent behaviors to be accepted, only to then turn around and be disappointed and resentful. Still working on that. I had to rewire my perception, because a lot of those behaviors came from feeling that I was obligated to tolerate behaviors that were harmful to me just because of somebody's position. So see how it's simple, but it's not easy. And this is why support is so important in the process.